Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to resilience, crisis management, business continuity, COVID, anything that's relatable to those subjects, and anything that helps you, your organization, or your community plan for, prepare for, and overcome adverse situations. If there is a topic you'd like us to talk about on the show, or you'd like to be a guest, please feel free. You can reach me through my LinkedIn profile. I am the only Alex Fullick on LinkedIn, so you can easily find me. And just reach out and we'll see about getting you on the show or finding someone else to come on and talk about what you want us to touch on. Longtime listeners on Voice America, you'll know that for quite some time I was talking about the Business Continuity Institute's Virtual World Conference in November, and I was a speaker there, and I had said that I hoped to be able to get maybe some other speakers to come on the show. And today I am lucky enough to have one of those speakers on the topic of organizational resilience, connecting the dots. I'd like to welcome to the show Caroline Sapriel. Caroline, welcome back.
Very nice to see you again, Alex. It's a pleasure to be here and talking to you today.
And I said welcome back for a reason, because hopefully longtime listeners on Voice America will remember you had a show that aired January, I even wrote it down, January 16th, 2020 on crisis leadership. We met at the Continuity and Resilience Today conference in Toronto in 2019.
That's right. Those were the days when you could meet face to face. And it's almost a year. I mean,
Yeah.
16th of January, we are the 25th. Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Time
how
flies.
things have changed too.
Yes.
You know, just in case anyone didn't hear that episode, could you take a minute or two and introduce yourself, what you do, and how you got into the industry?
Of course. So I'm the managing partner of CS&A International. We are a global risk crisis and business continuity consulting firm. We specialize in crisis anticipation, prevention, mitigation, and recovery. In other words, we really help organizations across industry sectors be better prepared for crises before, but also prepared to answer or deal with a crisis, but also recover from a crisis. And we've worked around the world for 30 years. This month is our 30th anniversary, so we'll be celebrating a number of events. Thank you. And we basically devoted and dedicated ourselves to helping organizations be better prepared, whether it's something they can anticipate and sometimes some things they cannot anticipate. So the title of your show and your podcast is absolutely appropriate. Preparing for the unexpected.
That's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Now, your topic at BCI was organizational resilience, connecting the dots. So to you, what does organizational resilience mean and represent?
Well, what I've noticed over the years is that unfortunately, organizations that have crisis management departments or custodians or business continuity custodians or risk managers, quite often they are not connected and they operate in silos. And there's an incredible amount of confusion among these different terms. And we've been advocating an integrated approach for a long time. And I believe that an integrated approach, which looks like detection, anticipation, mitigation, and recovery, should be pulled together under one framework. And that really means good and solid operational resilience. Unfortunately, you don't see that a lot. Very often, risk is in one department or one function. Crisis management is sitting across communication and health and safety, or communications and quality. And then you've got the business continuity people that look at business continuity. And I believe that that is a recipe for having holes and gaps which are not addressed. And that was the purpose of my talk at the BCI World Conference, because I believe there's quite a bit of work to do to try and pull it together.
It reminds me of an old saying that a camel is a horse built by different groups that never seem to meet, and you end up with a camel instead of an actual horse because
Yes.
everybody's working in a silo and nobody's talking.
Yeah, and I actually believe that the reason everybody's working in silo is because of the historical development of each part of that. So risk has been around for a long time, and it was primarily a financial or insurance instrument, and of course, it became more of a safety or a big safety instrument as well. Crisis management, crisis communication, initially was emergency response for high risk industries, has been around for 40, 50 years. Recently, in the last 20, 30 years, it's been, kind of developed also in terms of crisis communication. And then business continuity came onto the scene. But if you look at it, business continuity only came onto the scene with Y2K. It didn't exist before because it was the first time ever that businesses and organizations could see some potential failure in front of them they had to prepare for, which in itself is not crisis management, because crisis management means that there is a surprise component.
Mhm.
Y2K was not a surprise. So the term business continuity really came on the scene with that. Of course, got even more strengthened with 9/11 and then with the financial crisis, because everybody looked at how do we prevent failures? How do we put in place a number of mitigations and recovery mechanisms so we can deal with these failures? And so because of that historical development, I've seen different organizations taking it from the exit, which is business continuity, and try to work backwards, and others starting from crisis management, but not connecting the dots with risk management or business continuity. So it's a bit disjointed, and there's a lot of inefficiency there. And I think that's the reason. It's a historical development that has made it kind of disjointed.
So how do you bring everyone together to create some sort of resilience framework?
Well, we developed already quite a few years ago, I think about 15 years ago, an integrated business contingency framework, which pulls together risk management, crisis management, and business continuity. Risk management being the preventative um, um, section, the area where you start to look at what could go wrong. And this is where you put in place risk management systems with matrix of likelihood and severity of impact. You start to plot your risk on a risk register. You build a risk committee. You assign owners to try and look at the potential areas where there could be problems or where there is an enhanced risk area, and you try to manage it proactively. The challenge with risk management, in my experience, for a lot of business executives and a lot of people, is that risk hasn't happened. Therefore, it is very abstract. It's very hard for the human psyche to come to terms with something that might happen unless you're a real professional in this field and you really have trained your mind to consider, oh, this could happen beyond the obvious. It's very abstract for a lot of people. And then comes into the picture ERM, which is enterprise risk management, which is even more technical, even more abstract. And a lot of people don't get it. So therefore, it's relegated to that department of experts and professionals to deal with it for everybody else. But in fact, if you really want to build a risk culture, you have to create a pull-up phenomena where everybody from the shop floor all the way up has a sensitivity for what might go wrong, a risk that could materialize, things that are not right, and pull them up or bring them up so that they can be dealt with. So that's the preventative area. In the middle, you have what I call the response and management of when a risk has materialized, which is it becomes emergency or a crisis. And in there, you have emergency response, crisis management, crisis communication. These are plans that are designed to ease or to take the pain away from difficult situation by having a modus operandi for the teams so that they don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. In fact, those plans can be perceived to be quite generic. And God forbid you build your crisis plans on specific scenarios because you'll never make it. So that is the way to respond, the way to be prepared. How do we organize ourselves so that we can work through these disruptions and manage it as quickly, as efficiently as possible, with ultimately protecting the peer principle, which is people, environment, asset, reputation. The focus should always be in that order. If you do it in that order, you have a chance as retaining trust from stakeholders and carrying your activities not so only from an asset, operational, financial, but also from a reputational point of view. Beyond that is business continuity. Of course, every time there's a crisis, that means that there are a number of disruptions. Things fail and they have impact. Now, if you do your risk management process properly, you will have in your matrix and your risk register identify a number of critical risks. Those critical risks need to be owned up by someone. Plans and mitigating actions need to put in place. And if a critical risk materializes, it becomes a crisis. And that crisis may have business continuity consequences. Therefore, for every critical risk should be a series of business continuity plans. Business continuity plans are often scenario-based. So for instance, a pandemic is a major disruption, as we know. What are the business continuity plans that you need to have in place to be able to withstand this mega crisis? And there can be a number of them, depending on your activities, your scope, what you do, your geographies, et cetera, et cetera. And I think, unfortunately, there is confusion and it is not pulled together. But for it to be pulled together means you can have a view before, you know how to handle it during, and you know what to do afterwards or immediately during to secure as much as possible the continuation of your activities despite the disruption.
Now, that gives me a question because a lot of what a lot of organizations tend to forget is the after part, which is if you're not learning from what you just went through, all those different pieces that you explained, if you're not learning, then you're not actually making yourself resilient. You're just kind of, okay, we made it through. Well, now you're going to face the same thing again, a few months down the road when something similar occurs, because you're not making a change, you're not learning something, you're not being resilient. So what should we do once we've that last part, the before, during, and after? What should we do there?
So as much as I said that the risk part was the preventative, the crisis and emergency is the response part, the business continuity is the restore and curative part. Everything that is coming out of there needs to be fed back into that risk process. Otherwise, you miss opportunities. And unfortunately, you're absolutely right. It happens very often. Miss opportunities to improve and close gaps and create improvement plans. The challenge is when a big crisis is over, a lot of people get so fed up, you have fatigue, like there will be, and there already is fatigue with COVID-19. Mm-hmm. And so people wanted so badly to be back in their business as usual or normal mode that the appetite for learning from mistakes is what makes the difference between an average organization, in my mind, and a high reliability organization, where actually risks and failures are seen as opportunities to do what we do better and be stronger, be more robust. So what can be done afterwards? It starts with formal after action reviews. So if you've had a major failure, whether it's caused by yourself or outside, it's almost irrelevant. If you're a victim of an outside event, you still have learnings to take on how you handled that outside event. Mm-hmm. If the failure is actually internal because something failed in your system, in our own system, even more so. So you have a formal after action review, which really looks at what was the problem. After action reviews actually is a term coined by the US military during the first Gulf War. And the idea that for every project and every undertaking, there is a formal process to capture the learning and create an improvement plan.
Project management calls it lessons learned. But do you think do you think organizations sometimes skip that part or don't want to do that part because after action reports or lessons learned, whatever term an organization wants to use, those exercises end up becoming finger pointing exercises and blame games? and then people
It's
shy
often
away, from actually wanting to contribute. This is what I learned, but I know you're going to blame me for what I learned, so I'm not going to say anything.
Yes, I agree. I think that is part of the problem. And you find the same in audit processes when an audit is undertaken. For compliance, very often people are concerned about being finger pointed. And I think that goes back to the beginning. What kind of culture do you want in an
Mhm.
organization? Do you want a culture that where people are shying away from reporting problems or expressing issues because they're afraid they're going to be looked at, or you only report problems instead of solutions, and they're afraid of being finger pointed. So I think that's definitely a factor. I think the fatigue is a factor.
Mhm.
But it's a repeat, it gets repeated in history. And many years ago, and I'll use this as an example. I read a fantastic book, but one of the by an American who was stationed in Yunnan, in the south of China, Hunan, sorry, working with as part of the early precursor of the CIA, which was called the OSS. At the time, there was it was before the end of the war. It was during the Mao and during the revolution, and before the war ended. And the American State Department believed that there was a lot to learn from what Mao was doing, especially because the war was going on and the Americans were trying to fight the Japanese. And so they agreed, and Mao agreed, and Judo and all his generals, to have a small team of American OSS officers stationed with them in Hunan to operate, to observe how the Chinese communists were fighting the Japanese in China, which was primarily guerrilla tactics.
Mhm.
Well, then we all know that Hiroshima took place, and that ended the war. All those incredible learnings were buried deep in the State Department. And when the Vietnam War happened, nobody, absolutely nobody, went out and looked at this up. And in fact, exactly the same tactics were used by the Viet Cong. And I
Interesting.
think that's a very good example, in a very big way, in an extremely huge sort of world event way, that it also happens that leadership changes. People have different priorities. So, and people don't learn from mistakes, unfortunately. So I think it's a combination of that fatigue. And so I think the AAR is a first step. There should be always an AAR or a series of AAR after a major event. And from that, I think it's smart to create some case studies, create a template for case studies that deletes or that removes any reference to confidential detail, but a template that can actually be shared with different operations around the world, especially when when it's a first event in the organization.
Mhm.
We ran after SARS, during the H1N1 actually period. A client of ours asked us to run an assessment of their preparedness throughout Asia Pacific, and how they would handle H1N1 and so on and so forth. Well, we interviewed and worked with a number of teams across the region, and the China team, it turned out that through this exercise, the China team had put in place a number of pandemic plans that nobody knew about, because they had to improvise on the fly during SARS. And the assessment uncovered those plans that had been buried at the bottom of a drawer, and they were able to use them for enhanced preparation for H1N1. So that's an example of a missed opportunity of work that was done and was not shared.
Hmm. Now I'd like to talk about what are some of the common themes and factors of today's crises.
I think it is interesting to look at these common themes, and they have changed over the years. I started in this field about 30 years ago, and I still remember the fear of clients because CNN could be on their doorstep, and it was the beginning of 24/7 cable news. And people were like, oh my God, And of course, if CNN was sending a crew to do a story on something specific and an event happened around the corner, they would be there in an instant. Well, over the years, everybody's gotten used to that. I remember at the beginning, people were saying, oh my God, how do you know, we didn't call them in. How do we deal with this 24/7 cable news? Well, now we have social media, fake news, AI, everything that is compounding that sort of speed of information and disinformation alike, which is very difficult and can be intimidating,
Mhm.
especially because it's in flux. The social media of today is not the social media of 8 years ago. And the fact is that it is degenerating to a state where people are beginning to really wonder whether there should be a level of oversight on some of these
Mm.
so-called free internet, the same way as broadcasters have a number of oversight policies and framework. So I think media, social media definitely is a key factor, but it's a key factor that reflects another one, which is globalization and the interdependencies of systems. So globalization, everybody was brandishing the globalization flag because it, symbolized the free world, free movement of people, of goods, and everything else. With that comes a raft of problems because to be globalized, everything is connected and interconnected. So a flood in Thailand can cause a massive disruption to auto industry because manufacturers, as happened in 2011, are majorly disrupted by factories that are flooded and cars that cannot get off and be exported, as an example. And there are multiple examples of that. There's a wonderful book by called The Butterfly Defect that explains very, very well, which I thought was very inspiring when I read it. It's by Golding from the London School of Economics, of how this interconnectedness and dependency is actually brought a raft of enhanced risks and makes it so much more complicated.
Mhm.
The second, and the other two I would say that are attached to globalization is climate. Um, we got a planet that we're finally having to deal with, and so climate is not dealing with borders. It happens everywhere. Climate extremes is another one, and of course health, and as we're living it today. And so all these factors are coming together and they're compounding any disruption or any crisis. And you put on top of that public outrage. So the internet, the media has opened up so much the ability for people to express their outrage about something, to galvanize and pull together incredible mobilized support to express outrage. So a lot of crises today are actually a reflection of societal pressure and the general public saying, we're fed up and you got to do this differently. So it's all connected, and those are the forces that I would identify. Whereas 20 years ago, if I had told clients, yeah, you have to look at public outrage, but it was, the pressure wasn't the same because it wasn't brought to bear in the same way. We didn't have social media, we didn't have the internet. So I think those are the main ones.
Are there differences because the way you described some of them, a flood can be a sudden event, and with dependencies, I was thinking the Fukushima incident in Japan and the tsunami that triggered all of that. Is there a difference, or what is the difference between some of those crises that are sudden, like an earthquake, floods, and you talked about in your presentation smoldering crises.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between those?
Okay, so an event or a sudden crisis or event-based crisis is a massive accident, an explosion, a fire, an earthquake, all those things that are, yes, they might happen, but it's very hard to pinpoint when or how they could happen and what is the likelihood that they could happen. Now, you could, of course, say that Indonesia's got a serious problem with their safety and therefore they need to do something about it at this point. But otherwise, air accidents, even as an example, are very hard to predict. So those I would consider sudden. The ones that are much harder to kind of get a handle on, even at the risk level, that's why when we talk about a risk register, we really need to include issues. And what I mean by issues, an issue is a gap between an organization and its public on a particular topic. So to illustrate that, a pharmaceutical firm may have animal testing. in order to test the products. There's a whole body out there of people who are dead set against animal testing. So there is an issue. If the gap becomes too big and there's no dialogue, well, some activists may show up at the lab, free a bunch of monkeys, or actually take people hostages. And then you've got an event as a result of an issue which has been going on for a long time and has not been addressed sufficiently. It's, again, intangible and much harder for organizations to get a handle on, because issues that cause crises or are smoldering are much harder to detect, much harder to manage, and much harder to get traction about from colleagues and other executives and other management or managers or other members of the industry.
Wouldn't that be a part of? Wouldn't that be a part of the risk factors that you mentioned, earlier on? Capturing some of those and paying attention to them.
I totally agree. But if you ask most people, and I've seen hundreds of definitions from different companies, an issue is often described as an incident. An issue is not an incident. An issue is exactly what it says, which is a gap in perception about a topic between an organization and its publics. It can be at the source of an incident. So unless people really understand issues for what they are, they're going to have a hell of a time to actually include those potential or issues or potential issues in their risk registers. But they should, especially if you take into account one of the factors I mentioned, which is public outrage. And there are plenty examples of those. If you look at the outrage that went on in China with Dolce & Gabbana's latest campaign with this Chinese model struggling to eat spaghetti with the chopsticks, which caused outrage in the industry. It is not the first time that Dolce & Gabbana has a crisis as a result of an issue or something that they hadn't thought about, which in this case is cultural insensitivity. A few years ago in Hong Kong, Dolce & Gabbana had a silly policy that people could not take pictures of their storefront that were decorated before Chinese New Year. So a Hong Kong shopper came out of the store and wanted to take a picture and was told by a security guard, policy, you can't take pictures, which in itself is a little bit ridiculous. But then, so he posted something on Facebook. He said, this is really weird. How come we can't take pictures of this beautiful storefront? Well, a few days later, I don't know exactly, some Chinese mainland shoppers came out of the store with lots of shopping and turned around and took lots of pictures and posted them on the internet. Outrage, because at the root of that was perceived discrimination by Hong Kong people, in favor of mainland shoppers. And again, Dolce & Gabbana took 3 weeks out of Milan to apologize and recognize that this was cultural insensitivity. And in fact, this movement on Facebook galvanized an incredible following. And they had demonstration on the street. A lot of stores were closed by the police just because fundamentally there was an issue growing in the Hong Kong population that Chinese shoppers are treated more favorably than homegrown shoppers. And that's just an example.
Well, it's interesting that definition you had of issue, because in project management, an issue is something that has to occur first. Although if it hasn't occurred and there's no impact, it's still a risk. And maybe that's why some people don't, using your title here, don't connect the dots. Sometimes an issue,
yes.
If I'm interpreting this correctly, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Sometimes an issue hasn't occurred per se, but an issue is a topic you need to address. Is that a
Absolutely.
correct way of saying that?
The gap. Yes, yeah, and it's the gap between the organization that has that topic and the lack of recognition that some stakeholders or a large part of the public or their stakeholder are actually not seeing this the same way as they should or as they are. And therefore you have this gap. And unless this is addressed, and what is interesting, where is if you have an incident-based crisis, you aim to resolve it by putting out the fire and doing all the things. An issue sometimes cannot be resolved, but it needs to be addressed. And as long as there's dialogue, it doesn't go up to a flashpoint. It can stay dormant, or it can stay what is managed, because there is dialogue. I mean, we live in a world with multiple opinions. You're going to have at any given time a group of people that are against or don't agree with what you do. And if you don't recognize that, the opinions dig in, and it becomes a bigger problem. And then it flares up and it bubbles up. It is like a fire. It's like a smoldering. And then all of a sudden something happens and the flame comes up. That's why we call this a smoldering crisis. Sometimes smoldering crises are just a result of deliberate cover-ups. The Volkswagen emission scandal is a classic example of a smoldering crisis. There was no event. It was a revelation of something going on for 10 years that was not addressed. So in this case, it wasn't so much that there was a disagreement with a group of stakeholders. It was much more the fact that the company went ahead and did something, kept it under wrap, hoping that it would be kept on the wrap, except this started getting traction, and all of a sudden there was a whistleblower. So more and more, we are advocating clients that they should have two definitions of crisis in their crisis manual. One is an event-based, and the other one is a smoldering one. And that helps management response teams to be more attuned, have better antennas for those types of smoldering situations.
So when these situations occur, and to go back to the resilience part, who needs to be in the room to help address the situations, but also instill this sense of resilience going forward? Who should be in the room for these kind of things?
Well, I think you need to have a custodian of the topic. So whether it's the risk manager, the crisis manager, business continuity, doesn't really matter. But in order to pull sufficient data and information and input, there should be what is called a risk and issues committee, which meets regularly. It could be top managers or representatives of different functions that have actually their antennas, both internal and external, to flag things that seem to be getting traction or attention, and try to scenario plan them to see whether that could actually eventually escalate to a point of disruption and crisis. So I think a committee needs to take that seriously. So organizations that have real well-functioning risk committees that include the CEO are the ones that are really building resilient organizations. When the risk committee is delegated to too low in the organization or fragmented, so for instance, the safety people will have a risk committee, the finance people will have another risk committee. Again, you're creating a disjointed, disconnected process and system, which is a problem in itself.
In your presentation, you talked about the culture ladder in crisis management. What is that?
So the culture of the crisis management culture ladder is something we inspired ourselves from the Shell Hearts and Mind safety HSE or safety ladder that was developed by Shell, because we wanted clients to recognize that you could never be perfectly prepared for a crisis. It is not a destination, it's a journey. The world around us evolves, and therefore there are new risks, and we need to be cognitive of those risks and take them into account and evolve our preparedness for those risks in order to be resilient, in order to be more and more resilient. Unfortunately, it can be perceived to be ungrateful, because you can never say, oh, now we're perfectly prepared. As long as you move up that ladder, I think that's what's important. When I started in this business, the majority of businesses, except those high-risk industries that were legislated to be prepared, were really hovering at the bottom of the ladder, which is pathological. Who cares as long as we don't get caught, and reactive, to the middle part, which is we are kind of prepared. We do things we probably could do more, and we continuously look for ways to being prepared. So my feeling is that majority of industries are hovering around the middle. There's probably very few that are in the sort of progressive state where they really look at risks and crises as opportunities to do their business better. So as long as you keep going up that ladder, you're doing well. I think it's a nice framework. It's not meant to be a test. It's a little bit of a benchmark for yourself to say, okay, where were we 5 years ago? Can we say that we have actually moved up that ladder today?
I guess that's if you're not moving up the ladder, does that mean, and this is something else you mentioned, does that mean you're a train wreck?
Not necessarily, but it means that all the efforts you've put in for so many years are a little bit wasted. And we've had situations like that with clients who would prepare and train year on year and really improve. And for whatever reasons, a couple of years gap go in there. And when you go back in the training room, you realize they've gone backwards in terms of skills, in terms of preparedness. So we've had that. No, I think the difference I want to make between crisis and reputation train wreck is the impact of stakeholders on crises. And in fact, in the integrated contingency planning model that we offer, there is a line running through the sort of pre, during, and after that talks about stakeholder engagement, stakeholder communication. People need to know how they're impacted, how they could get impacted, what their role is in that preparation, what else they can do. One of the critical difference between a crisis and a reputation train wreck is the loss of stakeholder trust. So in a crisis, it can be difficult to resolve. It can last a long time. A lot of people can be impacted. But if at the end of the day, the general consensus is that stakeholders' trust has been preserved and in some cases even enhanced, then you're okay. You can turn the page and you will have learned. In the other part where it's a train wreck, stakeholders have lost the trust. They're not, they don't have confidence anymore. And to recover from that is much harder. And in fact, some businesses plainly don't. They either have to be rebranded or they get acquired or something else happens because the stakeholders are saying, I don't like you and I don't trust you and I don't like doing business with you, even though you actually solve the problem. So I think that's the main difference. And I think clients have to have a view as an ultimate mission and objective in a crisis to prevent a reputation train wreck. Accept they might be in a crisis, accept that there are causes that they could do their best, but they have to prevent that loss of stakeholder trust because their stakeholders are their best currencies. They give the organization the license to operate.
When a crisis occurs, if I'm a stakeholder, and I'll use you and I as an example, I'm one company, you're another company, you have a crisis, your reputation so far hasn't been hit by me. Do I base that until I see what your response is, whether you're responding well or not responding well, and then I decide, you know what, your reputation, I'm just not sure I want to work with you anymore based on the decisions you're now making. It seems like there's a bit of a gap there where as a stakeholder, you're kind of holding your breath. What are they going to do? And then you don't make your decision, until, Caroline has made her actions known.
I think that that's very true, and that's why we advocate, active stakeholder mapping. A lot of organizations think they map their stakeholders by just making lists. Mapping a stakeholder is really trying to position whether they're on your side, they're against you, or they're neutral. In a crisis, the ones that are neutral can shift. They can go against you. So anticipating those shifts, anticipating what actions those stakeholders could take against you to make the situation worse is a critical executive task. And actually, executives need to be trained in that. It's not necessarily a complex process, but there has to be a tool and a framework for that. Once you've mapped the stakeholders, you can zero in on the ones that are really going to make the difference for you. And you're absolutely right. Stakeholders kind of wait and see to see what the others are doing. They're influenceable, especially in today with social media and everything that's going on. So I think you need to proactively engage those that you think you can positively influence. Of course, if if you're an oil and gas company, you got a major spill, where now is perhaps not the time to reach out to Greenpeace, because Greenpeace is not really going to be on your side anyways. So who else do you need to reach out to? There is a false sense, I think, among executive teams that they have the power to influence everyone. And in a crisis, you need to zero in on the ones where you can have influence and really keep a careful watch on all these stakeholders and how they interconnect. And that's what we talk about: a stakeholder map, a stakeholder web. And we developed a process called Untangle, very much for that reason, because it's a little bit like untangling this web of connections that actually can make the situation worse. I am, after all these years in my field, I am a firm believer that the stakeholder pressure can really make a crisis worse, even if the problem is actually resolved.
Now you got me thinking, can stakeholders influence other stakeholders
Yes, yes, absolutely.
for the better or the good?
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So we do that in normal life on a day-to-day basis. When we have conversations with friends and colleagues and associates, we try to convince each other that we're better. We see, and I think in a crisis it's very much the case. Unfortunately, there's another side to this today, which you see in COVID, in the COVID crisis, is the conspiracy theories, but you also saw with the American elections. I think this is where families are really broken, because some member of the family has gone completely on the other tangent of these conspiracy theories, and there seems to be so little things you can do to bring them back to sort of a middle. I think those are extreme. They have to be monitored, because these people, as we know and we've seen in the last few years, can have massive impact. A lot of violence can be coming out of that. So then there's not much you can do to prevent it, but you got to be prepared to handle it, which is different.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, stakeholders can influence each other. That's why you also have industry associations that speak on behalf of a particular sector, that try to speak and put out a better, a more understandable version of the problem to the public or the stakeholders. Yes, they can, very much so.
Would that be a part of your mapping during a crisis? Mapping your stakeholders is, I need to focus on a vendor, but A works very closely, has a good relationship with B vendor, so we need to also focus on B, because A could change their opinion of us.
Absolutely. And so it is a methodology around it that is not necessarily difficult to grasp, but needs to be really embraced by organizations to get a handle on this, to be more proactive. And it's incredible how much I see when I work with companies that, stakeholder mapping is still, for a lot of people, just a list of stakeholders. What do you do with a list? Oh, so I know that this could be a stakeholder. The idea of stakeholder mapping is that you understand where they are and that you can do something with it. To just list them is only the starting point. In fact, you can do that before a crisis.
Yeah, it's just a list. It doesn't add really any additional value.
It's quite remarkable, because a lot of people spend time and effort and money on stakeholder engagement, but the actual mapping process has a lot to be desired for. It's not always very efficient.
Well, believe it or not, we only have 2.5 minutes left. Could you take a minute and a half with any final thoughts on organizational resilience, connecting the dots?
Yes, I'd love to. And I think it is important to maybe connect it back to the world we've lived in now for a year. I think one of the challenges for public health crisis, and this one exemplifies it, is the inability to come to terms with, how do I communicate something I don't really know a lot about without creating panic, and at the same time prepare for the worst. So the saying is, hope for the best and prepare for the worst. I've written a blog recently about this. I think it should be reverse. It's prepare for the worst and hope for the best. I think managements, governments need to prepare for the worst. It is essential to be able to withstand any crisis, but especially a crisis of this magnitude, whilst at the same time standing up, giving leadership, communicating effectively, not mincing your words, but making it in such a way that is palatable for the public to accept, okay, we're in good hands. And there's not many places where that has been well done. So the stakeholder mapping, in a way, brings the ability to plan for worst case scenario, but the human psyche is not very comfortable with worst case scenario. If we're in a bad situation, how can we continue to think that it could even get worse, which is exactly what's happened.
Yeah.
So it's a very much a leadership skill and attribute, and I don't think a lot of people have demonstrated that as well as they could have.
And the worst case scenario keeps changing.
Yes,
you know.
and it's going to get worse before it gets better. And it's a very famous adage of crisis management: crises get worse before they get better. But the human psyche doesn't like that. Every time there's a glimmer of hope, we think, we're done, we've turned the corner, we're good now. Hence, everybody going on holiday and doing all sorts of things they shouldn't have done because they thought it was over. But, can you blame people? I don't know, but you could definitely put more responsibility on those that are in charge to do this work of planning for the worst and giving hope to people.
And on that note, I think that's the perfect spot to end. Caroline, thank you very much again for talking with me today. I know it's your second appearance here, and it was enjoyable the first time, and it was enjoyable this time. So thank you very much for sharing your time.
Thank you, Alex. It was a pleasure. And stay healthy. Be careful also, and hopefully next time we speak, we will not be in a pandemic anymore.
With an ocean apart, maybe we'll be back as we were in Toronto, face to face. That would be nice.
That's right. And then people should continue to prepare for the unexpected in the meantime. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you, and you're very welcome. And to everybody listening and watching, stay prepared, everyone. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.